The van rumbled down the narrow, fog-choked road as Declan gripped the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the dark trees on either side. Spooky Hollow. The name alone sent shivers through the spines of anyone who heard it. Once just an old mining town, it had become a place where even the bravest dared not linger after sunset. Now the team was here, summoned by the government to investigate the recent gruesome killings. Bodies ripped apart, locals whispering about creatures, about things crawling in the woods. The mist thickened as the van slowed to a crawl, its headlights barely cutting through the eerie gray. Declan glanced at his team in the back. 5 experienced paranormal investigators, but even they seemed uneasy. "We're here," he said, his voice low, gravelly. He parked in front of an old, abandoned house at the edge of the hollow. It loomed over them, its broken windows like empty eyes watching their every move. The team stepped out, their breaths misting in the cold night air. Silence greeted them. Not even the wind stirred the dead leaves that blanketed the ground. Declan's skin prickled. "Something's off," whispered Sarah, the team's tech specialist, as she unpacked the EMF meters and thermal cameras. Her hand trembled slightly. Declan nodded but said nothing. He had felt it too, the sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. They spread out, setting up their equipment around the perimeter. Night had fully fallen now, the darkness swallowing the landscape whole. And then, without warning, a low, guttural growl echoed from the woods. Declan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Did anyone else hear that?" he asked, gripping the handle of his flashlight tighter. The team nodded, their eyes wide. The growl came again, closer this time. Before anyone could react, a shape darted out of the trees. Something low to the ground, fast, a blur of movement. It knocked over one of the motion sensors, then vanished back into the shadows. Declan's pulse raced. "What the hell was that?" he muttered. Sarah frantically checked the thermal camera. Nothing. It didn't show up at all. Another growl, this time from the opposite side of the clearing. The team turned, their flashlights flickering. A shadow moved between the trees, impossibly fast. Declan felt a chill crawl up his spine as the mist swirled around their feet. Whatever was out there, it was hunting them. "Inside now," Declan ordered, and the team rushed toward the old house. They slammed the door shut just as a scraping sound echoed against the walls, like claws raking wood. "We're not alone here," Declan whispered. Outside, the growls grew louder, more guttural, as the unseen creatures circled the house. And in the silence between each growl, there was something worse, the sound of something breathing just outside the door. Morning came, but the oppressive feeling of being watched never lifted. The sun barely pierced the mist hanging over Spooky Hollow, casting weak, sickly light across the landscape. Declan's team had survived the night, but they were rattled. Sleep had been impossible, with the constant scratching outside the house. It didn't take long for the first emergency call. A local family, deep in the hollow, had been attacked violently. The team packed up quickly, and within minutes, they were on the narrow road, heading deeper into the cursed land. The house stood at the edge of the forest, the front door hanging from its hinges. Blood smeared the walls and floor. Declan's stomach turned as he surveyed the scene. Broken furniture, shattered glass, and deep claw marks were everywhere. The family was gone, but judging by the destruction, they hadn't gone willingly. "They fought back," Sarah muttered, crouching near one of the claw marks. But whatever did this, it wasn't human. Declan knelt next to her, examining the symbols carved into the walls. Strange, ancient markings, spirals, and crosses. "This isn't just an attack," he whispered. "This is a warning." A rustling in the woods outside drew their attention. Declan stood, his flashlight sweeping the tree line. "Something's out there." As they stepped outside, the temperature seemed to drop. The trees were unnaturally still, the air thick with the scent of decay. Declan led the way into the woods, following the trail of claw marks and blood. A dark shape darted between the trees, too fast to be human. "Did you see that?" one of the team members whispered, fear lacing his voice. "Stay together," Declan ordered, his hand on his pistol. "Whatever's out here, it's hunting us." Suddenly, the shadow reappeared, closer this time. A tall, thin figure draped in darkness. Its face, or what passed for a face, was nothing but a void, eyes like pits of blackness. A shadow man. It moved with unnatural speed, flickering in and out of view. Sarah screamed as it lunged, its long fingers reaching out. Declan fired his weapon, the sound deafening in the eerie silence. The figure vanished before the bullet could hit. "Run!" Declan shouted, and the team bolted through the woods, heartbeats pounding in their ears. The shadow man followed, a constant blur at the edge of their vision, always just out of reach. They didn't stop until they reached the road, gasping for breath. The shadow was gone, but its presence lingered. "We're being hunted," Declan said, his voice grim, "and it won't stop until it gets what it wants." The underground bunker was not on any map. The entrance had been hidden beneath a collapsed barn at the far edge of Spooky Hollow, its rusted steel door buried under years of debris. When Declan's team found it, they knew they had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the stench of mildew. Declan led the way, his flashlight beams slicing through the suffocating darkness. The walls were lined with old, decaying files, records of paranormal activity and government experiments. It was clear that whatever happened here had been buried, forgotten by time, and for good reason. "Look at this," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She held up a yellowed folder, the pages inside detailing the sudden disappearances of local townspeople over the last 70 years. "It's all connected. People have been vanishing for decades." Declan flipped through the pages. Families gone without a trace, entire households wiped out. The same criminal family name kept popping up, the descendants of the Hollow's original settlers, rumored to have dabbled in dark rituals to control the land. "Whatever they started, it's still going on," he said, his voice grim. As they ventured deeper into the bunker, the temperature dropped sharply, and a heavy sense of dread hung in the air. The narrow corridors twisted and turned like a maze, leading to a large circular chamber. In the center stood a rusted metal table, stained with something dark and dry. Declan's heart pounded as he approached it. Shackles were bolted to its sides, and strange, demonic symbols were carved into the surface. "This is where they took them," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is where the disappearances ended." A sudden, bone-chilling screech echoed from deep within the bunker, freezing them in their tracks. Declan raised his flashlight just as something moved in the shadows at the far end of the chamber, something hunched and malformed. A skinwalker. Its eyes glinted with a predatory hunger, its body twisted and stretched unnaturally, as if it were something once human but no longer. "Move," Declan shouted, pulling Sarah back as the creature lunged at them. It was fast, too fast. They barely made it to the narrow corridor when the skinwalker slammed into the wall, its claws scraping inches from Sarah's back. Declan fired his gun, but the creature barely flinched, the bullet grazing its sickly gray skin. They ran, the creature's footsteps heavy and erratic behind them. The bunker twisted into a labyrinth, the walls closing in as the skinwalker gave chase, its growls echoing in the narrow halls. By the time they reached the entrance, the creature had vanished into the shadows again. But they knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching. As they emerged back into the cold, misty air of Spooky Hollow, Declan's breath came in heavy gasps. "There's more of them," he said. "We just woke something up, and it's not going to let us leave." The dawn came cold and gray, but instead of relief, it brought terror. The team had barely escaped the skinwalker in the bunker, but now something far worse awaited them above ground. The air was heavy with the smell of rain and something else, something rotten. Declan's radio crackled to life, a voice coming through, panicked and distorted. "Multiple attacks, all over town. They're everywhere." Declan cursed under his breath, grabbing his gear as Sarah frantically checked the EMF meters. The readings were off the charts. Something was happening. The ghosts of Spooky Hollow were no longer content with lurking in the shadows. They were attacking. They rushed into town, only to be greeted by chaos. Buildings stood half-ruined, windows shattered, doors hanging open. People screamed in the distance as ghostly figures flickered in and out of existence, appearing at random, attacking anyone who came too close. Declan's pulse raced as he spotted a pale, translucent figure hovering near an abandoned gas station, its eyes hollow, its mouth stretched into an unnatural scream. A group of paramedics arrived, their ambulance lights flashing in the mist. They began helping the injured townspeople, but something was wrong. One by one, the paramedics started to vanish. First, their shadows stretched unnaturally long. Then they faded, their bodies pulled into the ground, their voices trailing off into the wind. "They're taking them," Sarah whispered, eyes wide with terror. Declan set up the team's equipment, EMF detectors, motion sensors, everything they had. But none of it mattered. The ghosts were beyond their reach. Even the most advanced tools couldn't stop the spectral forces converging on them. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the town square. Declan spun around to see the old church doors splintering as ghostly apparitions flooded out, their forms shifting and contorting, their faces twisted in agony. The air crackled with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. "We need to fall back," Declan shouted, pulling his team toward the nearest building. But before they could reach safety, one of the team members was yanked into the air, their body suspended by an invisible force. Their screams echoed across the empty streets before they vanished completely. Panic gripped the remaining team as the ghosts grew bolder, their forms becoming more solid, more aggressive. One lunged at Declan, passing through his chest like icy smoke. The pain was indescribable, cold and searing all at once, like his soul was being ripped apart. He staggered backward, gasping for air, as the ghost circled for another attack. "We have to stop this," Sarah said, her voice trembling, "before the whole town disappears." Declan knew she was right, but how could they fight something they couldn't even touch? As the ghosts closed in, he realized they were running out of time. The discovery of the underground bunker had been chilling, but nothing could prepare Declan's team for what they found in the old library of the town hall. The once grand room was now a shadowy vault of ancient tomes and dusty relics, the air thick with the smell of decay and forgotten history. A single candle burned dimly on an altar-like table, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "This place reeks of old magic," Sarah said, her voice filled with dread. She carefully opened one of the old, leather-bound books, revealing pages covered in arcane symbols and handwritten notes. "Look at these," she said, showing Declan and the rest of the team. The writings detailed a series of dark rituals performed by the criminal family, rituals meant to bind a demon to the land, to give them control over Spooky Hollow. But as Declan scanned the text, his eyes widened. The rituals had gone horribly wrong, unleashing a curse instead of securing power. The family's greed and ambition had damned the town. "This explains the hauntings," Declan said, his voice grim. "They summoned something, and it never left. It's been feeding off the town ever since." The team dug through more books and documents, piecing together the history of the curse. The dark ritual had involved the sacrifice of innocents to gain demonic favor. The altar, described in the texts as the heart of the ritual, was hidden in the mountains outside town, its power still active. "The ritual was incomplete," Declan said, his mind racing. "But if we don't stop it, the demons will be fully summoned." As night fell, they prepared to search for the altar. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual sounds of ghostly wails and cries replaced by a suffocating silence. The mist seemed thicker, swirling around them as they made their way to the mountains. The hike was treacherous, the terrain uneven and treacherous. The mist curled around their feet, making every step an effort. Declan's flashlight caught glimpses of shadowy figures flitting among the trees, but they were always just out of sight. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as though the very land was trying to repel them. When they finally reached the altar, hidden in a secluded clearing, the sight was horrifying. The altar was an ancient stone slab covered in blood-stained runes and demonic symbols. The air was thick with an unnatural heat, and the ground around the altar was scorched and cracked. "This is it," Declan said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is where it all began." As the team set up their equipment, preparing to disrupt the ritual, a sudden gust of wind howled through the clearing. The mist around them twisted and darkened, forming grotesque shapes. The ground trembled, and a low, guttural chant began echoing through the trees. "Get ready," Declan shouted, but before they could act, a shadow emerged from the altar, a dark, writhing mass that took shape before their eyes. It was a demonic entity, its eyes glowing with malevolent fire. Its form shifted and twisted, a horrific amalgamation of limbs and faces. The entity lunged at them, its form crackling with dark energy. The team fought back, using every tool at their disposal. Declan fired his weapon, the shots tearing through the demon's form, but only slowing it down. The entity roared in fury, its voice a chorus of tortured souls. In the chaos, one team member was thrown aside, their screams lost in the cacophony of battle. The demon's power surged, a wave of dark energy crashing over them. Declan and Sarah struggled to hold their ground, the ritual's power growing stronger with every passing second. "We have to destroy the altar," Declan shouted, but the demon's onslaught made it nearly impossible to reach it. As the battle raged on, Declan realized that they couldn't defeat the demon without dismantling the altar. But the darkness seemed to close in around them, each moment more harrowing than the last. The clearing around the altar was a scene of chaos. The demon's power surged with every second, warping the very fabric of reality. Declan and his team were pushed to their limits, their tools and weapons barely making a dent in the creature's overwhelming force. The altar, a dark and ancient stone slab, loomed in the center of the chaos. Its runes glowed with an eerie red light, pulsating in rhythm with the demon's roars. Declan knew that destroying it was their only hope, but getting close was nearly impossible. "Sarah," Declan shouted over the din, "we need to break the runes. It's the only way to weaken the demon." Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. She grabbed a set of iron tools from their equipment and started hacking at the runes, her hands shaking with every strike. The demon, sensing their intent, roared and lashed out, sending waves of dark energy cascading through the clearing. One of the team members, Ben, stumbled as he tried to provide cover. He was thrown against a tree, his body crumpling to the ground, unconscious or worse. Panic surged through the remaining team as they struggled to keep the demon at bay. The air crackled with the tension of the battle, the ground shaking with each of the demon's enraged roars. Declan and Sarah fought through the chaos, each step a battle against the overwhelming darkness. The demon's form seemed to shift and change, its eyes glowing with an intense, malevolent fire. Its voice was a cacophony of screams and curses, each sound more terrifying than the last. "We're running out of time," Sarah yelled, her voice barely audible over the din. "The runes are almost gone." Declan nodded, his own strength waning as he fought against the demon's attacks. He could see the altar's power weakening, but it wasn't enough. The demon roared in fury, its power surging as it sensed its hold on the land slipping. Suddenly, the ground beneath them cracked, and a dark, swirling vortex began to form around the altar. The demon's form seemed to grow even more chaotic, its limbs writhing and twisting as if trying to escape the impending destruction. "We need to finish this," Declan shouted, struggling to keep his footing as the vortex grew stronger. He and Sarah redoubled their efforts, smashing the remaining runes with every ounce of strength they had. The demon's roars grew more frantic, the dark energy around it becoming almost unbearable. With one final, desperate effort, Sarah struck the last rune. The altar shattered, the runes disintegrating into dust. The vortex's power surged, pulling the demon into its dark maw. The demon screamed, its form twisting and distorting as it was consumed by the darkness. The clearing was filled with a blinding flash of light, and then suddenly everything went silent. The ground was scorched, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and burnt flesh. Declan and Sarah lay on the ground, exhausted and battered, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The altar was gone, and with it the demon's presence. But as Declan looked around at the destruction, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Hollow was still watching, still waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The battle was over, but the horrors of Spooky Hollow were far from finished. Dawn broke over Spooky Hollow with an unsettling calm. The mist had settled, but a thick, oppressive fog still clung to the town. Declan and his remaining team members were barely holding on, their spirits battered by the night's horrors. They had narrowly escaped the demon's clutches, but their victory felt hollow. They needed extraction, but the government rescue team they had called for was nowhere to be found. Declan glanced at his radio, which crackled with static, "This is Declan. Rescue team. Do you read? Over." The only response was more static, followed by a disturbing, intermittent burst of screams and distorted voices. Declan's heart pounded. They had no way of knowing what had happened to the rescue team, but the absence was terrifying. The fog seemed to grow thicker, enveloping everything in a suffocating haze. "Where the hell are they?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. She checked the tracking device they had set up, but received no signal. "There's something wrong," Declan said, unease settling in his gut. "We need to find out what happened." They ventured to the designated pickup location, an old, dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was eerily silent, the only sound the distant, muffled cries of unseen entities. Declan pushed open the creaky door, and they stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the lingering scent of decay. The warehouse was in shambles, debris scattered everywhere. Declan's flashlight swept over the wreckage, illuminating abandoned equipment and empty crates. His eyes narrowed as he spotted a blood-stained radio lying on the floor. "Check this out," Declan said, picking up the radio. The device was damaged but still functional. He turned the dial, trying to pick up any signals. The radio crackled to life with a garbled transmission, punctuated by static and what sounded like frantic shouts. "Location: We're surrounded." Declan's blood ran cold. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a deep, rumbling growl that reverberated through the warehouse. "Get ready," Declan ordered, his voice steady despite his fear. "Something's coming." The team spread out, their senses on high alert. The growling grew louder, echoing through the empty warehouse. Suddenly, shadows began to shift and writhe on the walls, taking on menacing, grotesque forms. One by one, the shadows coalesced into nightmarish shapes, ghastly apparitions of twisted faces and skeletal limbs. The rescue team's fate was becoming clearer with each new horror. From the depths of the warehouse, a figure emerged. It was a hulking, misshapen creature, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. Its form seemed to ripple and change, like a living nightmare. "We need to get out of here," Sarah yelled, but the warehouse's exit seemed to warp and shift, the door now an unreachable distance away. The creature advanced, its movements slow but deliberate. Declan and the remaining team members fought back with everything they had: holy water, salt, and protective wards. But it was clear that the creature was immune to their efforts. In the chaos, one of the team members was dragged into the shadows, their screams muffled as they vanished from sight. Panic set in as the remaining members fought desperately to escape. Declan grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward a small side door. They burst through the door into the fog outside, gasping for breath. The warehouse loomed behind them, silent once more, but the sense of dread was palpable. The rescue team was lost, consumed by the darkness of Spooky Hollow. "This is a nightmare," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "How are we going to get out of here?" Declan didn't have an answer. The mist closed in around them. The town itself seemed to conspire against their escape. They were alone, and the horrors of Spooky Hollow were far from over. Nightfall returned to Spooky Hollow with a menacing quiet. Declan and the remaining team members, now heavily battered and weary, huddled in what remained of an old cabin on the outskirts of town. The walls were thin, the roof sagging, and every creak and groan of the structure seemed to echo with a sinister intent. The battle with the demon had left them physically and mentally drained, but the danger was far from over. The air was charged with an eerie, static electricity that made every hair on their bodies stand on end. Declan knew they had to make their final stand, if they could just survive the night. "We need to reinforce this place," Declan said, his voice rough. "We can't let them get in." The team set to work, nailing wooden planks over the windows and doorways, using every scrap of material they could find. Outside, the mist had thickened, forming a dense, swirling shroud that obscured their view of the town. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the night, followed by guttural, feral growls. The creatures of Spooky Hollow were closing in. Declan grabbed his weapon and signaled to the team to take their positions. The fog pressed in, thickening until it was almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The first wave of attackers emerged from the fog, skinwalkers, their forms twisted and contorted, eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They surged forward, claws and fangs bared. Declan and his team fought back with everything they had. The clash was violent and chaotic. The skinwalkers moved with terrifying speed, their attacks almost impossible to anticipate. The cabin's defenses held for a while, but the relentless assault took its toll. The wooden planks splintered, and the door was soon battered open. Declan's flashlight flickered as he fired at the advancing creatures, the bullets barely slowing them down. "Fall back!" Declan shouted. "Get to the cellar!" They scrambled down into the cellar, but the creatures were relentless. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and fear, and the sounds of the skinwalkers clawing at the entrance filled the darkness. The cellar was small, barely large enough to fit the team and their equipment. The team fought desperately, using every tool and weapon they had. The EMF detectors and thermal cameras flickered erratically, overwhelmed by the supernatural energy. The skinwalkers' growls and screeches were deafening, their claws scraping against the cellar walls. In the dim light, Declan saw a shape moving among the shadows. A shadow man, its form barely visible, but exuding an aura of pure malevolence. The shadow man's eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. It reached out, its tendrils of darkness curling around the team, choking the life out of them. Declan and Sarah fought the shadow man with all their strength, but it was like fighting smoke. Every time they struck, the creature seemed to shift and blur, becoming even more elusive. The team's efforts seemed futile as the shadow man's presence grew stronger, suffocating the room with its dark energy. Just when it seemed they would be overwhelmed, Declan spotted an old, rusty pipe wrench lying on the floor. He grabbed it and swung at the shadow man with all his might. The wrench passed through the creature's form, causing it to recoil. Declan took the opportunity to strike again, this time with a concentrated effort. The shadow man's form began to dissipate, the darkness retreating as the wrench connected. The cellar fell silent, the shadow man vanquished, at least for now. The team was battered and exhausted, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Declan looked around at the remaining members, their faces grim and weary. The battle was far from over, and Spooky Hollow still held many secrets. The night was still and oppressive, with the mist hanging heavier than ever over Spooky Hollow. Declan and his team had managed to survive the horrifying battle at the cabin, but the danger was far from over. The discovery of the ancient curse tied to the criminal family added a new layer of dread to their already desperate situation. Inside their temporary refuge, the old library of the town hall, Declan reviewed the information they had unearthed. Sarah, pale and weary, was poring over old family records that detailed the lineage of the criminal family, records that suggested an unexpected twist. "There's something we missed," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "One of the family members might still be alive. Are you saying there's a descendant of the family still in the hollow?" Declan asked, his voice edged with urgency. Sarah nodded. "According to these records, one of them was hidden away to escape the curse, but they were supposed to return at a certain time, one that matches our current situation." Declan's mind raced. If there was a descendant still alive, they could be part of the curse, unwittingly contributing to the ritual. But before they could act, a loud crash echoed from outside the library. The team tensed, grabbing their weapons and preparing for the worst. The library's doors burst open, and a shadowy figure stumbled in, their face obscured by the dark hood of a cloak. The figure's eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and a chilling laugh echoed through the room. "You're too late," the figure said, their voice a distorted whisper. "The ritual is nearly complete, and the power of the demon will be unstoppable." Declan's blood ran cold as he realized the figure was none other than a member of the criminal family, a descendant who had unknowingly played a part in the curse. The figure revealed a ceremonial dagger, its blade etched with the same runes that had cursed Spooky Hollow. "It's you," Declan said, his voice tight with anger and fear. "You're the key to this entire nightmare." The figure laughed, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. "Yes, and soon the demon will walk the earth, and all will bow to its power." With a sudden, fluid motion, the figure lunged at the team, the dagger gleaming in the dim light. Declan and the others fought back, their weapons clashing with the figures. The descendant was surprisingly strong, moving with a dark, unnatural grace. As they fought, Declan noticed something horrifying. The figure's form seemed to blur and shift, as if reality itself was bending around them. It was clear that the curse had endowed the descendant with otherworldly abilities, making them nearly invincible. The battle was fierce, with the descendant using every trick to evade their attacks. It was as if the very shadows of Spooky Hollow were protecting them. The team struggled to keep up, their breaths ragged and their movements desperate. Amid the chaos, Declan realized that they couldn't defeat the descendant without breaking the curse first. He grabbed the records from Sarah and, with a sudden burst of inspiration, began to chant the counter-ritual he had found in the texts. The descendant's eyes widened in horror as the words took effect. The room was filled with a blinding light as the curse began to unravel. The descendant's form flickered and wavered, their powers waning as the ancient magic was undone. With a final, anguished cry, the descendant collapsed, the ceremonial dagger falling from their hand. The curse had been broken, but the Hollow's darkness was far from extinguished. Declan and his team were left battered and shaken, the realization that the true battle was still to come weighing heavily on their minds. The final night in Spooky Hollow was a night of reckoning. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the desolate town. Declan and his remaining team members, exhausted but determined, prepared for the last stand against the malevolent forces that had plagued them for so long. The ritual had been disrupted, but the demonic power was still present, and the Hollow was far from safe. Declan knew that they had to confront the remaining supernatural threats and destroy the source of the curse once and for all. They made their way back to the mountains, where the demonic altar had once stood. The clearing was now a twisted landscape of dark energy and smoldering ruins. The fog seemed to pulse with a malignant life of its own, swirling around them as they approached the ruins. "Stay sharp," Declan said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We don't know what's still out there." As they moved through the clearing, they saw the Shadow Man, its form fully materialized and more terrifying than ever. Its eyes glowed with an intense, otherworldly light, and its presence seemed to distort the very air around it. "Here it comes," Sarah shouted, her voice trembling with fear. The Shadow Man lunged at them, its form shifting and blurring as it moved. Declan and the team fought back with everything they had. The Shadow Man's tendrils of darkness lashed out, wrapping around them and choking their movements. The team's weapons seemed ineffective against the Shadow Man. Declan grabbed a flare gun from their equipment and fired it at the creature. The flare burst into a brilliant light, momentarily pushing the Shadow Man back. But the respite was short-lived. From the fog emerged the Skinwalkers and other demonic entities, their forms writhing and shifting as they joined the fray. The battle became a chaotic, nightmarish struggle. Declan and his team fought desperately, their bodies aching and their minds frayed by the relentless assault. In the midst of the battle, Declan spotted a glimmer of hope, an old, rusted mechanism buried in the ruins. It looked like a device that might have been used in the original ritual. With a surge of determination, Declan and Sarah fought their way through the creatures, reaching the mechanism. "If we can activate this," Declan shouted over the din, "it might be able to dispel the remaining dark energy." Sarah nodded, her face grim but resolute. They began to work on the mechanism, their movements quick and precise. The dark entities around them seemed to sense what they were doing, growing more frenzied in their attacks. As the mechanism whirred to life, a blinding light erupted from it, cascading over the clearing. The creatures recoiled, their forms disintegrating into the mist. The Shadow Man let out a final, agonized scream as its form was pulled into the light. The light grew stronger, engulfing the entire clearing. Declan and Sarah shielded their eyes from the brilliance. When the light finally faded, the fog had lifted, and the clearing was eerily quiet. Exhausted and battered, Declan and Sarah looked around at the now tranquil scene. The demonic entities were gone, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. But as they left Spooky Hollow, a chilling thought lingered in their minds. The darkness had been defeated, but Spooky Hollow still held its secrets. The horrors they had faced would remain etched in their memories, a grim reminder that some places are cursed beyond redemption. As they drove away, the mist seemed to linger in their thoughts, a constant reminder of the nightmare they had survived.